Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on two aspects of this idea that the administration has developed. The likelihood of evasion, but also the price cap level itself. The Treasury's guidance on the price cap plan so far indicates that the policy is constructed as a prohibition on service providers within the G7 countries who finance, insure, and broker Russian oil transactions above this price cap level, wherever it ends up being set. And as I said, I am hopeful that this will be effective. It strikes me as a very constructive step. But obviously, it is not meant to apply. It does not apply, certainly not directly, to oil service providers outside the G7. We've seen a huge increase in Indian and Chinese purchases of oil, just as U.S. and European purchases have declined. In fact, those purchases have fully offset the decline of the U.S. and the EU. And my concern is that China and India will continue to buy Russian oil, and probably on a large scale, they'll do so with their own service providers. Might not be quite as convenient as the existing regime, but they're quite capable of insuring and brokering and financing oil sales with indigenous companies and capabilities. So I wonder if briefly, Ms. Rosenberg, you could comment on any concerns you have that there is still this mechanism, this opportunity for Russia to continue to sell oil, albeit not to G7 countries or those who use services of G7 countries, but outside of the G7.
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to address these important questions. This price cap policy envisions a scenario where countries, China and India, for example, continue to purchase Russian oil. That is envisioned within this policy. Yeah. And it's possible that they could purchase that oil below the cap using G7 services. For example, there's a distinct advantage for them to do so. 80 to 90% of maritime insurance is concentrated in service providers within the EU, or rather within Europe, which means that India, for example, has a powerful interest in purchasing some of that oil below the price cap in order to take advantage of those services, which provide more reliability.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm short on time here. There's no question everybody would like to buy oil as cheaply as they possibly can. And I completely acknowledge that this regime, if it's effective with G7 countries, might very well have some downward pressure. But there will also be efforts to evade it. There will be countries that will see an opportunity to get more discounted oil, even if it's not fully discounted to the price level. This is why I think it's important that we address this question. I acknowledge that the big majority of the market for the service providers comes from companies within the G7. They would be affected by this, but they don't have monopolies. And the Chinese and the Indians, as I say, they're quite capable of expanding the role of their indigenous service providers. This isn't meant as really even a criticism of this arrangement. I'm suggesting this is why Senator Van Hollen and I have introduced legislation that would require sanctions to be imposed on those who would evade this way. Let me ask you another question, if I could. What's your best estimate right now of the marginal cost of producing a barrel of oil in Russia?
Senator, there's varying costs for doing so. It depends on the geology of the field, the technology involved in lifting, and the cost over time of amortization. I hope I could take just 1 second to address a key facet of the point you made earlier.
Okay, but I do have another point I need to get to, and we've got a minute, so if we could do it quickly.
A key aspect of a successful price cap policy is the international approach involved here and the entirety of the G7. It is the case that some service providers may be able to function outside of it, but the broad coalition of the G7 and the existence of price cap means that even outside of it, purchasers have the opportunity and leverage in order to ratchet down the price that they pay.
I get that, and I'm hoping that dynamic works. And if that market dynamic works and Indian and Chinese buyers end up paying no more than the cap price, then our sanctions legislation is kind of moot. It'll sit there as a backstop without doing any harm, without being implemented. But if it doesn't work, and let's be honest, the Russians have taken in a lot of revenue we didn't fully anticipate, then we'd have a backstop. My point on the price level is I think it makes sense, and I'm open to an alternative idea, but I think it makes sense. I don't think you guys have set a price cap level yet. I hope it will be very close to the marginal cost of production, and I get that that varies over the course of a massive country like Russia, but still, keeping it as low as possible diminishes the profits that the Russians make. I think that's a very important step. But last point, Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, just an observation for Mr. Adams' sake. I know the administration has proposed expanding justices' resources and tools to pursue administrative civil forfeiture and punish sanction evasions. I think enhancements might very well be appropriate to penalize Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but the administration's proposals seem generally not to be limited to Russia, nor to be time limited. And I think we should proceed very, very cautiously before we decide to expand these prosecutorial and administrative powers in areas unrelated to this invasion. Thank you.